Hey, it's concrete. Uh, Pretty much already know the drill by now. More Flavorah beta testing. Again, just to reiterate, I did not pay for these. But today I have their smoked butterscotch, their pucker, and their pastry zest. So let's start testing. So decided to start off with the actual like single flavor out of this, the smoked butterscotch. Um, I have it here at 2%. So right off the bat, what I get? I get a butterscotch that's a whole lot like Flavorah's regular butterscotch, which is a good thing. I like Flavorah's regular butterscotch. It kind of splits the difference between like a harder, crisper, like caramelized sugar note, and then it has some actual like kind of butterscotch sauce, almost candy, kind of buttery chewiness to it. That's definitely still in there. The smoke part of this is interesting. It's definitely a like sweeter wood smoke. It's not like a tobacco smoke. It doesn't have any kind of ashy or dirty note to it. It actually reminds me a lot of Flavor Art's Black Fire, especially when you start cranking up the percentages. It's that same kind of sweet, almost like hickory smoke kind of taste. Uh, they're actually mixed together really well. The smoke here is sort of acting as an accent for the butterscotch, at least, at 2% and under. Kind of brings in a little bit more warmth. It's an extra dimension in the flavor. Um, it kind of nestles itself down in there actually between some of those like harder, drier caramelized sugar notes and that softer butterscotch base to it. Doesn't really call that much attention to itself, but it does sort of add an extra layer of sort of warmth and interest to the butterscotch overall. In terms of off flavors, one of them is with Flavorah's butterscotch in general. There's a bit of like a slight cardboard note that you get with some of the softer like caramel type flavors, those kind of sauce flavors. I do get a little bit of that from the butterscotch. It's not really detectable when you're mixing it. Generally, it's one of the first things that kind of gets fixed in a mix. But if you're doing it solo over about 2%, you start to pick up a little bit of that cardboard. The other issue here, that smoke note, while it's really good when it's in balance, it starts to kind of push itself out of balance. Again, right up around 2%, which is at least convenient. And you start to taste something that tastes a lot like mixing just straight black fire with butterscotch. You kind of lose some of the cohesiveness of the flavor. Instead, you get butterscotch, then smoke, which isn't really what you want. You want smoked butterscotch. So in terms of where to use this, the obvious pairing would be tobaccos. Butterscotch makes its way into a lot of tobacco mixes. This is kind of a no-brainer if you don't already have that kind of sweeter wood smoke note in there from using something like black fire. It's going to add a little bit more dimension to the actual tobacco smoke note instead of like just throwing more ash or anything acrid on there. It's a sweeter smoke that helps to kind of fill out tobacco vapes. I think that there aren't a lot of applications where I end up using butterscotch that I think this smoke flavor is really going to stand out. I don't mind a little bit of smoke, and I actually like that sweet wood smoke note in a lot of things. Butterscotch usually ends up in like bakeries paired with cream, stuff like that. And I think the smoke here is sort of subtle and well balanced enough that it isn't going to clash with those creams or those bakeries. I can see using it in like a slightly drier bakery as kind of an accent if you're already going to use some butterscotch or some caramel. I can also see it working really well in like ice creams, sort of playing the warmth of that smoke against some cooling. Shouldn't clash too badly with like richer eggy notes either. Starbucks actually makes a like smoked butterscotch latte or whatever. So if you're ever in the mood for something like that, Could see this mixing really well with like coffee flavors too, kind of bolstering up coffee flavors and sort of trying to take that more of a burnt popcorn note that you get with coffee and kind of bend it into something that's a lot more pleasant. In terms of percentage usage, this really didn't come alive for me until maybe about 0.5%. The 0.25% accent was a little bit low. That 0.5% was starting to fill in a little bit, but it kind of tasted like a more interesting butterscotch rather than a smoked butterscotch. Up around 1%, you start to get like the distinct, like, hey, this is a smoked butterscotch. 1.5%, a little bit richer, still pretty good. Up around 2% is where I started running into the problems with like kind of the flavor separating. And the base going a little bit cardboardy on me. But it's a really interesting, well-done take on a single flavor. I don't think you couldn't get there using something like Blackfire and their straight butterscotch, but I mean, it's nice to have it in one bottle, and if you're going to be using it, especially in tobaccos, it might be worth the extra, scratch. Just go ahead and pick this one up because it's already well balanced. So, next, we have an additive. So I saw they're putting out a flavor called Pucker, and I was like, oh, hey, maybe that's just a generic sour note. I really like the sour note from Flavorah Sour Apple. Hopefully they just bottle that up. That isn't what this is. This is definitely a tobacco additive. I thought people were crazy saying, oh, no, it's a tobacco additive. But no, it's definitely a tobacco additive. So, the name Pucker makes you think it's going to be sour. It's going to be a sour tobacco additive. That isn't really my experience. I do get a good amount of tartness in this, but it's pretty distinct from like a citric sourness. It's more tart like green apple without actually having much green apple flavor in there, or like kind of tannic like underripe Bartlett pear skin, something sort of in that vein. It definitely comes through. It's all right up in front too, and then there's actually like a discrete tobacco note in here too. There's a lot of like almost like a wet hay flavor to the tobacco on the back end. It actually reminds me a little bit of Flavor Art's Ozone. If you've ever tried that, it's a tobacco additive that's supposed to be like a coumarin additive. And it does seem to have some of that same kind of, not even necessarily grassy, like I'm thinking with grassy, you're talking more like acetone. This is definitely more of like a distinct like hay flavor. And there's quite a bit of sweetness to it too. It's not necessarily something I'd call like a caramel sweetness or even like a maple sweetness. It's sweet, but it feels sweet in a really interesting way. I used this analogy in my Ozone review and didn't get any pushback on it, so obviously it must be 100% correct. But it's kind of sweet on the back end, like warm water tastes sweeter than cold water. It's very interesting, but it definitely adds quite a bit of sweetness to that sort of like hay tobacco on the back end. And there's just a little bit of I'm not even sure it's quite ashy, but there's just a little bit of like a dirty ashy note to the end of this that you don't get too much when you're actually vaping it, but it kind of builds up in the back of the throat. So I'm 100% comfortable calling this tobacco additive. And since it's an additive, I did do some tests mixing it with different types of tobaccos. I can start with the one that didn't work at all. It didn't work with Flavorah's Red Burley. I love Red Burley, but it's definitely more of a dessert tobacco. It has some sort of nutty, chocolatey tones on there. You wouldn't necessarily think you'd want that to be more tart, and hey, turns out you really don't. The tartness on this kind of just sits at the front of the flavor, just right off the bat. So you get like that initial burst of tartness, and then it goes through and it seems to kind of lift up some of the leafy tobacco notes and push some of the like woody, leathery tobacco notes up to the forefront too. And it does do a considerable amount of kind of sweetening of the back end of the tobacco. So that did not work well with the Burley. I'd sort of extrapolate from that. You probably don't want to mix it with any of your dessert type tobaccos. If that tartness doesn't get you, I feel like the extra sweetness will kind of push them a little bit cloying. It did a little bit better with cured, Flavorah's cured tobacco. That has a little bit more of a woody note, but it also has like a more mellow, nutty side to it too. And it worked really well with the woody, leafy note, kind of reinforced that, but I ran into some of the same issues with the back end of that getting a little bit sweet, and then that tartness not really working with any of those nutty notes. I had much better results with their Cavendish, actually, which is a pipe tobacco. And Cavendish is a little funky. It has like a very musky, aromatic note to it. This sort of bolstered the pipe tobacco underneath. It kind of brought that tobacco more up to the forefront and seemed to tone some of those musky notes a little bit. And then it actually sweetened up the back end considerably, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing for the Cavendish. It kind of made it feel like a sweeter pipe tobacco overall. And that was, I think, mixed at something like 0.5%. So the place where this worked that it really surprised me that it worked was with their Arabian tobacco, which is a lot more aggressive. It has kind of a drier, like herbal note to it. It doesn't have a ton of body. This actually helped that out substantially. While I did get that sort of tartness at the beginning, and it kind of amped up the drier woody parts of that and played well with that herbal note. It was definitely still aggressive on the front end, but what it did for me is clean up that back end a lot, kind of smooth out and clean up that back end with an extra sweetness. So in terms of pairings, obviously I'd avoid dessert tobaccos. Seems to work pretty well with pipe tobaccos. And then for that kind of like Oriental-ish, whatever that actually means in the context of tobacco, or like Turkish or Arabian kind of tobacco blend, it seems to kind of mellow those out a little bit. It makes the beginning of them pop a little bit more, which runs the risk of getting a little bit too aggressive, but it definitely smooths out and cleans up that back end. The other place where I think this would be really interesting is coming in with something more like an analog cigarette flavor, something that's a little bit dirtier and ashier. That extra pop at the beginning is going to help kind of sell that sort of harsh cigarette taste. And there's just a little bit of cooling in here. It's not even really worth noting too much, but you can definitely pick it up, and it seems like it's going to be a good bridge for like a menthol cigarette, like a Newport or a Cool or something, because that sweetness at the back end that it adds to a flavor, adding in some menthol or some cooling is going to help kind of clean up that exhale and keep it from getting too cloying, but still giving you like a nice rich flavor. But yeah, weirdly named, but it seems like a really solid tobacco additive. So, last for today, I have their Pastry Zest. Again, we got an additive. So what I get from this, I get like a bright lemon juice tartness up front, whereas the Pucker was kind of like tannic. This doesn't have that going on. It has just like a straight lemon juice tartness. And when I say lemon juice, people start freaking out. It's not like a Flavor Art bakery where it's X plus lemon. There's no real lemon flavor to it, and there's also no like real citric bite, but it has that like initial burst of sort of brightness to it, and then the middle just doesn't exist. There's very little, if any, sort of actual bakery flavor underneath that. Towards the back end, you start to get like a very textured, like sugar note. At low percentages, it feels a lot like a powdered sugar coating, and then as you start to increase the percentages, you start to get more of like a granulated sugar feeling. I feel like it maybe picks up a little bit of cinnamon, but it's not anywhere in the same league as like Flavorah's rich cinnamon for that really bold cinnamon taste. It's more just like an extra warmth to the mix. So mixing with this, you're gonna want to sort of play to those strengths. That tartness up front when you're mixing with it just stays right up front. It doesn't move. It doesn't blend down into the base. It just gives you an initial bright, tart pop right at the beginning of the flavor. For that reason, I would kind of go for fruit forward bakeries. You want something that leads with the fruit, and then that lemon juice can go ahead and bring a little bit of extra dimension, that fruit note up front. I'm thinking like pies and tarts and cobblers, anything that has like a heavy fruit note and then has a bakery crust, so you don't really mess up your layering. I could see maybe trying to make this work for something like a fruit-filled bakery, like a filled donut, or almost, I'm not going to say Pop-Tart because it's doesn't really seem like it's going to do a great job with that, but like a fancier Pop-Tart, like an actual like pastry with something inside. I could see trying to make it work, but my issue with those is generally those end up leading with the pastry, and you're going to get that tart burst like right when you want that pastry to sort of start in on the layering. So I'd stick to stuff that's definitely more fruit heavy. That powdered sugar note at the end actually works really well with those kind of flakier crusts too. It also kind of sits on top of a mix, but that's not really a bad thing with that note, because what you want is like that extra dimension of like flavor, and it feels a lot like there's actual like either powdered or granulated sugar like added on top of the pastry crust when you mix it. Because that tart note is not really blending for me. My use percentage for this is mostly sort of dictated by how much of that tartness I want. I found that this is maybe a little bit too subtle, down around 0.25%, 0.5%, kind of comes into its own more around like 1%. And then at 1.5%, you get a pretty noticeable burst of tartness, but it doesn't really take you out of the entire mix. And that powdered sugar note is starting to get granulated. You're starting to pick up some of the cinnamon. It's very satisfying. But then you start to push up towards like 2%. And that tartness is just a little bit jarring for me. So I would end up using this somewhere around like 1.5%. I think it'd be great in something like an apple pie. I tried mixing it with Flavorah Arts apple pie, which has a really good crust note, but it doesn't have much apple to it. And that little burst of tartness up there really made like the little bit of apple that was in there pop. So that would kind of be the direction that I go with it. But hey, at least the name makes sense on this one. It's actually pretty solid. So thank you for watching. I do appreciate it. There will obviously be more of these. I'll catch you later.